and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. And welcome to my end of the season deep dive series. I will start at the back of the pack and work my way to the front. So today I'm doing a deep dive into Alpine and compare them to the teams that are around them. So I will start off with Alpine and compare them to generally the team that finished behind them and in front of them. But since they're at the back of the pack, I'll just compare them to the one that's in front of them. And as well, I will look at the drivers from the Alpine team and the Drivers' Championship and compare those drivers to the ones that finished around them in the Drivers' Championship. So the ones that finished right behind them and the ones that finished right ahead of them to try to give you a good picture of how well that Alpine driver did this season. So I'll start off with this nice little chart where it shows the team and the drivers and some nice little information about like where they started from and where they ended each the races from for each of those sessions on average, how many DNFs they had, and where of course they finished in the constructors standings or the drivers championship. I also have some nice little bits of information that I've dug up as well. So like Alpine dropped from 6th last year to 10th this year in the constructor standing. So why did they drop so much in this era where they were all compacted in? I mean, you'd think that Alpine could work upon what they did last year as the rules didn't change drastically over the year so that they could, get better on that front. But they lacked some of the high performance speed that they needed, for those long straightaways, those high performance circuits on that engine front. Their car was, described as unpredictable and unstable, so they couldn't really get a grasp on how well to perform those little, nuanced changes to get the best performance out of that car. And of course, they didn't get any kind of updates from that car since June or the Spanish GP race, so they had a good amount of time where they just decided to shift to the 2026 regulations and try to work on that for those, issues that they were performing on, and maybe they can get a jump start on next year's regulations and get a better performing car to start off with. Now, if you can also look at the structure for the Alpine team, we find that their leadership changed mid-season as well, so that didn't help in the stability of the team and the morale that was going on with the team, so I'm sure that affected their performance as well. But also you can look into these aspects and try to get a general feel for how they did this season. So on average, Alpine started in that 16th position on those sprint races and finished in the 16th position on those sprint races. Now for the GP races, they moved up a little bit to like 14.5 to that 13.5 when they're finishing the GP race. And they had a total of 7 DNFs, 1 in the sprint race and 6 in the GP races. So they kind of had a lot of, cars that went off and could not finish the race for some reason or another. Now, if you break that down into the drivers, you can see that Pierre Gasly started off in 10th last year and went down to the 18th driver's position this year. His average starting position for the sprint races were 13.8. And his average finishing for the sprint races was 12.7. So he gained a position generally on those sprint races, which is a good thing. Now for the GP races, he started in that 13.4 marker, and he bumped it up to 11 on that finishing. So he did a lot better on those GP races, on getting those couple extra positions out of it, but not quite into that point position marker on average. So he got a few points in there, but on average, he was just below the points. And of course, he had 3 DNFs in those GP races throughout the whole year. Now you compare him to his 2 teammates that kind of got split up in the season. So we'll start off with Franco, who did most of the season. He was in 19th last year, and it went down to 20th this year in the driver's ranking. He did an average of 18.3 for the sprint, and was at the exact same at 18.3 for the finishing of the sprint race. He kind of bumped that up a little bit for the GP race to 16.4, and it was average finishing of 13. So he did quite a bit of movement in the GP race, gaining about 3.5 positions over the course of the year on all those GP races on average. Now he had 1 DNF in the sprint race and a DNF in the GP race, so he had 2 of those 7 DNFs for this season. Now, Jack Doohan, who was in there for about 6 races, he started off in 24th in 2024 and moved up to 21st, but that doesn't really matter because it's the back of the pack on either case. His average, sprint starting position was 16.5, so ahead of Franco Colapinto's, and about the same on his finishing position at that 18 position mark. And he was also ahead on the GP starting position at 15.4, and didn't quite make it up quite as far in the GP races on average, just up to that 15 mark. Of course, he had a lot fewer races to work with, so that kind of plays into that aspect as well. He had 2 of those DNFs in the GP race throughout those 5, so that kind of played a part in him getting replaced. Now, my personally thought is they should have left Doohan in there for a longer period of time before switching to Franco, because in my view, Franco did not really present himself that much better than Doohan in any case, and I would have given Doohan a little bit more chance to figure out that car and figure out what he could do. But the team decided to switch them out and keep Franco Colapinto in for the rest of the year, and it looks like we'll start him off next year as well. And of course, I have some team driver information that kind of gives you some insight into the team dynamics here as well. So if we're looking at specifically Pierre Gasly, he outperformed Doohan in the sprint qualifying 1 out of the 2 times that they competed against each other. Now for the actual sprint race, Gasly, beat Doohan both those times. So 100% of the time he beat Doohan in the sprint race. Now if you look at the other side, so if you're looking at Gasly and the sprint qualifying against Colapinto, 4 out of 4 times Gasly beat Colapinto in those sprint races. So 100% of the times he outbeat in the qualifying, but in the actual sprint races itself, he only outperformed Colapinto 3 out of the 4 times. So he only won 3 out of the 4 races if you're gauging by the final positioning for those sprint races for Gasly. But Gasly, you can tell, was dominant on all of those sprint races between both Doohan and Colapinto. Now, if you move down to the main GP race, he outperformed and qualified Doohan 5 out of the 6 times of the GP race, and then the actual race itself, in those final positions, it was 4 out of 6 times he outbeat Doohan in those races. Now, if you look at Colapinto and Gasly, he outperformed Colapinto 13 out of the 18 times in the qualifying sessions, and 11 out of the 18 times for the actual final result of those GP races. So that kind of gives you some little idea there on those team dynamics and how well Gasly was outperforming both of those new teammates that he had this season. Both Doohan and Colapinto were fairly new, so you expect a little bit of that, but not quite the dominance that kind of shown in this year's race, even though Alpine was performing poorly throughout this season. Now we'll look at these, same team in the sprint races. So this is the end results for those sprint races for those 3 teammates in Alpine. So Jack Doohan, Pierre Gasly, and Franco Colapinto. As you can see here, this is the graph of those 6 sprint races that we had this year and how well they performed against each other in this run. Of course, right now it shows that the trend lines for Jack Doohan was really, really good because, he went from that 20th position to that 14th position on the 2 sprint races that he actually performed in. So that's not a really good indication necessarily of how well he was improving in that run. But you can kind of get an idea more for Pierre Gasly and Franco Colapinto after those full 6 runs that they had, or the 4 runs for Colapinto in that regard. Now, the upward trend lines is, of course, a bad thing. It means that they're getting worse throughout the year, not better. So they started off fairly decently and got worse throughout this year as everybody progressed, and Alpine basically fell back into the back of the pack in that regard. And as I said, we're looking at the drivers and the drivers that are comparative around them. And since Jack Doohan is at the very back of the pack, and Franco Colapinto was just ahead of him, and we'll just basically throw these into the same graph here for these sprint races. So we can see Franco in pink, Jack in blue, and then Gabriel Bortoleto, which was ahead of Franco Colapinto in the driver's standings in this run. So we can kind of compare those together, and you can see that Franco Colapinto was getting much worse throughout this season, where Gabriel Bortoleto was getting better throughout this season. He started off, in the back of the pack, but he started having some decent markers and had that one off in Brazil a little bit, getting back to where he started off the season, but came back fairly decently in Qatar as well. So that kind of trend line was there, and so you can compare those back of the runner drivers in the sprint race connotation. And if you do the same thing for Pierre Gasly, who is in pink, and you see Gabriel Borlato, which is right behind him, and Yuki was just right in front of him in those drivers' standings, you can kind of see those markers and those trend lines here where, Yuki was pretty steady across the board in that 9th place for the sprint races, where Gasly was kind of moving from that, 11th marker and back in that trend line. So he's kind of getting worse throughout the year. And Gabriel Borlato was coming strong and kind of crossing his path around that Austin, Brazil marker in those sprint races. So he was getting better, where Gasly was getting worse, or that car was not getting updated to compete with the other cars in these sprint runs. And so that kind of fell out in these graphs as you can look at these and kind of compare those drivers around them in that run. And here again, we're looking at the Alpine drivers and looking at the main GP races that they were performing in. And so you can see Jack doing in those first 5 GP races, where you see Franco Colapinto picking up from that point on throughout the rest of the season, and Pierre Gasly in that red all the way across the season. Now you can kind of look at those markers, and you can see that Jack Doohan was getting worse off those 5 pretty strongly, but of course he had that bad start and the bad end of his little brief career in F1, where then Franco picked up and was doing about the same and had some offs in that mid-season marker. And of course, at the end, he had an off as well. So not doing much better in my viewpoint than Jack Doohan. And that kind of follows into my path as like, you probably should have left Jack Doohan in there to see if he could have, figured out how to drive that car a little bit better and perform better. Instead, they decided to switch in that mid-season marker, for Franco Colapinto, which didn't do a horrible job. It just didn't do that much better than what I think Jack Doohan was doing at the beginning of the season. And then, of course, you have Pierre Gasly in there that's still getting worse, but a little bit farther worse because he started off a little bit stronger than, Franco Colapinto and Jack Doohan in general. And as that car kind of got throughout the season and they didn't develop it, it kind of went farther and farther back to the back of the pack, where it's harder to get into those points and those average markers. And of course, again, those downward momentum is better because that's the position that we're looking at. And so the higher in this graph is, the worse off they are. And here's a little bit more deeper dive into, the Jack Doohan and Franco Colapinto's drives as we see them and compare them against each other, and then throw Gabriel Borlato in that mix, who has just finished just ahead of Franco Colapinto in the Drivers' Championship. So that kind of worked out that in that green. So you can kind of look at that and see how that, Gabriel was getting better throughout this year, partly because of that car was development through this process and started getting those tweaks that helped them out a little bit more in the mid-season pack, to the end, where the Alpine didn't get those updates they needed or the idea of how to resolve some of those, configurations on these tracks to get the best performance out of them. But you can kind of look at those and kind of compare, those GP races and how well they would have performed against each other, especially with the Franco and Jack Doohan markers that kind of roughly are along that same 15th position marker, whereas, Gabriel Borlato is a little bit closer to that, 14th, 13th marker on average, even though he's jumped all the way up pretty far into that 6th position in that, Belgium race. So he had some glimpses of glory there that helped him out. And of course, he had a couple of bad stints as well. But over on average, I think it was closer to that, it said 13th marker, 12th marker on average throughout this year, which, pushes that into perspective if you're looking throughout this whole season. And of course, you get a lot of these up and down paths with these lower end, teams, because they were like on that edge. And so one weekend they get a good, configuration, and the next weekend they don't quite get it all, set properly. And so they drop back farther in the pack. As this whole year, it seemed like the packs were so close together on trying to get through to those qualifying sessions, and the race itself was based on a lot of that as well, because if you didn't get a good start, you fell back, and then you couldn't really gain those positions quite as easily as you could potentially if you had a better car in the mix. They were so tightly packed, you had to really put your foot in it and get those really good passes done during this season. And this mess of a graph is between Pierre Gasly in that pink, Gabriel Bortoleto in that green, and Yuki Tsunoda in the blue. And as you can see, I basically just used Yuki from the Red Bull and not his Racing Bulls segment here. So he misses the couple of races at the very beginning here, but you can kind of follow that through. But of course, Yuki was actually getting better throughout this season, learning how to run that Red Bull, and Gabriel was the same way. That trend line was going down, which is a good thing, even though Yuki's was not quite as steep as Gabriel Bortoleto's in that running. You can still see they are being able to improve throughout the season, whereas Gasly was kind of falling back throughout the season. And they were saying mainly because of that way that car is configured and the developments on that car didn't pan out the way they were looking in their shift, to switch to 2026. So we're putting the bet on 2026 rather than trying to get into that 2025, Drivers' Championship or Constructors' Championship at this point. Now we switch over to the team markers, and we kind of look at the sprint races on the team front. And so you have Alpine in that back of the pack in that 10th marker, and Stake in that 9th constructor standings. So we're comparing those two, and it's kind of a funny graph here because Stake did not actually get any points in the sprint races. And so for the sprint races, you can see Alpine gaining a couple of points here in Miami and in Brazil, bumping up those markers. So a nice steady incline for those 6 races comparatively to Stake, kick F1, in that regard. And since the bar graph, for those sprint races was fairly dull, since it just had 2 bars on it, I just kind of bypassed that and went over to the GP races. So this is the GP, bars where they scored points compared to each other, and just the GP races and not the sprints. And so we'll have a combined one a little bit later that shifts slightly, but you have to know exactly what you're looking for. And hold on, let me move my image so that it give you a better view of that entirely. So here again, you see, Kick starting off the season fairly good, getting some points. And then, in Bahrain, Alpine coming back a little bit stronger. And then you have a little bit mixed. Of course, that mid-season went more to Stake Kick F1, and those green markers getting a lot more points more regularly than Alpine did. And that kind of followed out throughout the season to the end. And of course, this is the step graph of that same information and show how they compare to each other. And so you can see, basically for the GP races, if you're looking at it, it's like all the way through Monaco, it looks fairly even. I mean, you had a good start off with Stake F1 at the very beginning in Australia, but then of course in Bahrain, Alpine came on and kind of went and tied them for a while until Spain, and that kind of broke them apart. And from that point on forward, Stake just kind of gained a lot more points than Alpine did. And of course, I guess said this is just looking at the GP races, so you can kind of look at that, in that regard. And so you compare the two here in a second. So this is a combined point between the sprints and GP races. It's in the bar graph, so where they score points. So you can see like here in Miami, where Alpine gained a point, and then of course Brazil, they gained another point. So they kind of going up there a little bit. So very minute changes here in this graph for the bar graph, but you can look at the full overall picture here, where Stake F1 was pretty steady, maybe gaining a little bit of ground on that trend line. And this point, of course, is the points marker. So this is better going upwards than downwards, where Alpine started off and was going downwards throughout this season. So getting worse throughout the season overall in the point marker range for this season. And of course, if you look up into the step graph, this is very similar to the other one, but of course then you can see that little bit of lip that Alpine overtook Stake F1 temporarily for those Miami and Imola and in Monaco until they got to the Spain, and then that kind of split them up in that same regard. So you can look at that very early on where Alpine was able to overtake Stake F1 early in the season, but then Stake came back, you know, probably that right before that mid break, and just took off in those points running and just kind of ran away with it. And so that kind of give you a nice big gap at the end, you know, showing that, you know, they were steadily and pretty handily into that 9th marker instead of the 10th marker that we find the Alpine team in. And we'll try to do a deep dive next time into Stake Kick Sauber, you know, F1 team, and see how well they did. And so we'll be comparing them against Alpine a little bit, as well as, you know, the 8th running team in that regard. So we'll have to look into that drive and figure out where Gabriel Borletto compares to the drivers around him. And of course, you know, Hulkenberg, who is up a little bit farther in the Drivers' Championship, and figure out where he lines up well with those drivers around him. And that'll be next time. So if you want to see that, please subscribe so you get that notification. And hopefully you'll like this video and give me a thumbs up. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.